to join the Climate Justice Working Group meeting today. Why don't we start with some introductions? We know that we don't have all of our working group members here today, so we'll plan on using this meeting to review some key kind of questions and some outstanding decisions that the working group needs to make around developing the criteria for defining disadvantaged communities. So that'll be the focus of the conversation today. But why don't we start with a quick round of introductions of working group members. Abby, do you want to go first?
Sure, there I am. Okay, hi, I'm Abby and I'm here from the Climate Solutions Accelerator of the Genesee Finger Lakes region. Glad to see you all.
Thanks, Abby. How about Neil?
Hey, good afternoon, Chris. I'm here. Everybody.
Good afternoon, Neil. Rawa, I see you're on.
Good afternoon. This is Rawa Gurmatzian. I'm the director of Push Buffalo, located in Buffalo, New York, and unceded Haudenosaunee territory.
Good afternoon, Rawa. Sonal.
Hi, everyone. Sonal Jessel, pronouns she, her, Director of Policy at We Act for Environmental Justice.
Thanks, Sonal. And we're also joined by the team from Illume Consulting. So Amanda and Alex, do you guys want to introduce yourselves?
Hi, this is Amanda Dwelly from Illume, and we've been supporting the Climate Justice Working Group with the data and indicators for the disadvantaged communities criteria.
Hi, this is Alex Dunn.
Great. Thanks, everyone. And so we also have several staff from DEC and NYSERDA on the line as well to participate in the conversation today where needed. So let's jump into the agenda. Andrea, would you be able to advance the slide? Okay, so maybe just a couple of quick housekeeping items. As those of you who have been in this virtual world for the last year plus have come to realize, there can be a lot of crosstalk and background noise, in webinar settings. So we'll just ask that all of the working group members to please keep their lines muted unless they're speaking. Because the state has suspended the in-person requirements for the open meetings law recently, one of the things we're going to need to make sure that we do in these virtual meetings is to not only record the meeting, but also to transcribe the meeting. So one of the things that I'm going to ask that everyone does, which is a little bit new for this working group, is to just make sure you state your name before you speak. So that way we're able to make sure we attribute comments to the right person. So appreciate cooperation with that request. And with that, let's jump into the agenda. Next slide, please. Okay. So what we wanted to cover today with the working group is kind of a regroup of key issues related to defining the draft criteria. So we want to make sure that everyone is up to date on the upcoming schedule and kind of expectations for how, as a working group, we're going to spend our time over the next 6 weeks plus. And also make sure we're clear on the decisions that we need to be making over that time period. We did share last week with the working group members a packet of pre-read materials for this meeting. So we'll kind of walk through each of the primary components of that pre-read as part of the conversation today. But essentially, just refreshing on the legislation, just making sure, everybody is kind of grounded in kind of ultimately what we're required to deliver under the law. We want to talk a little bit about our disadvantaged communities scenarios and go through a summary of changes and talk through those. We want to talk about a couple of updated scenarios and then discuss some key considerations for low and moderate income considerations in this development list criteria. Next slide, please. Okay, so with respect to where we're going to be spending our time over the next 2 months, the DEC and NYSERDA team have really kind of taken a look at the work needed. We know in previous working group meetings, we've discussed the need to make sure that there was as much transparency as possible in terms of expectations and timelines related to all of this work. We've pulled together, kind of as far as we can see today, kind of what the outstanding work is and some potential dates to schedule meetings to kind of work through those outstanding items. So kind of the first item on the list here is the meeting today. So we're focusing on disadvantaged communities criteria only. So, again, back to the agenda, deep dive into the scenarios and, how we think about designating the communities. We're looking for additional dates for the next 3 meetings. So Alana has shared a poll, a doodle poll with the working group members. We've heard back from some, but not everybody. So we'll ask that, by Tuesday at the latest, everyone go into the doodle poll and fill out availability for the next 3 meetings. So essentially what we want to do is focus the next meeting on disadvantaged communities criteria as well. And then also, if needed, incorporate some discussions about, kind of the next discussion with the Climate Action Council. We are looking for a date during the last week of September for that meeting. So the poll kind of provides a few options between September 27th and September 29th. If needed, there's an alternate date of October 5th there. The second meeting we want to schedule is, again, focused on disadvantaged communities. And this is really, focused on getting us to a point where we can, build consensus around our preferred, approach to defining disadvantaged communities. And we're looking for dates in the second week of October for that. And then, the critical timeline here, kind of we're leading up to this, kind of with these DAC only meetings, is scheduling a time for the Climate Justice Working Group members to vote on the DAC scenarios and, which would also be essentially the scenarios that get posted for public input. And so we're looking at dates between November 8th and 19th for that voting session. We know that there's a lot of work, that everybody is currently involved in, and the work around, ultimately landing this criteria is complex. So we want to make sure that, if working group members feel like you need a little more time to discuss the scenarios or methodology, that, they have an opportunity. So as part of the conversation today, we want to just understand from everyone, whether or not you feel like you might need, some additional time one-on-one. So I know Amanda and Alex have, expressed their availability to have, individual conversations to help folks better understand the considerations here as we're thinking about the DAC criteria. And we could also set up, some smaller sessions, a smaller group, deep dive and Q&A session before we vote in November. So I want to open it up for conversation on that topic in just a minute. But in terms of, additional, visibility, the Climate Action Council is, planning on meeting October 1st. And that's when we plan on, as a working group, providing feedback on the remaining 3 advisory panels. So, back to the meeting the Climate Justice Working Group meeting in late September, we may want to use some of that time to prepare for the October 1st Climate Action Council meeting. There's also a Climate Action Council meeting scheduled for October 14th. So this is a meeting that the Climate Justice Working Group is not expected to participate in terms of providing any input. However, the preliminary agenda for the October 14th CAC meeting will include a preview of the draft scoping plan. So we're encouraging working group members to try to make themselves available for that meeting to hear kind of the preview there. We don't have times for that meeting yet, but we will provide them as soon as we get them. And then, while not finalized yet, there's also thinking around a November 16th Climate Action Council meeting. So there would be the potential for Climate Justice Working Group participation in that meeting as well. So, between now and then, we still have a lot of work to do on criteria, development and finalizing the scenarios. But we want to make sure you all have full visibility into the calendar as far as we can see it, today, between the Climate Justice Working Group activities and the CAC. Let's pause here. I guess I'm interested in reaction from working group members. So with respect to the working group schedule itself, do folks think that additional, conversations might be needed, in addition to those specific meeting dates that we have outlined here?
Chris, I think in terms of preparing for the next Climate Action Council meeting, we'll need to at least coordinate on our end somehow to find time to get ourselves organized for that. But besides that, the schedule looks good to me, and I appreciate the level of detail. Of course, the sooner we can get specific dates and times on the calendar, the better.
Point taken. Thanks, Abby. Yeah, and so in terms of dates and times, we'll make sure that we get those on everyone's calendar as soon as we can. We'll look at getting that, out early next week, as long as the times are ready and scheduled. So yeah, and in terms of preparing for the Climate Action Council meeting, so I don't want to put Samir Ranaday on the spot, but I know Samir's on the line and is planning to be available and to help coordinate, with the working group members. So so that's another coordination point that we can do offline, I think. Any other feedback on the schedule or any, thoughts in general about the next 2 months of activity here?
I have a question, Chris, in terms of the public comment sessions. Is there planning that we need to be accounting for those?
Yeah, so and also what we're gonna wind up doing is once we can lock in the dates for the Climate Justice Working Group meetings, through November, in parallel, we'll start to pull together a straw man schedule for those public input session dates, but then also the educational session. So if you guys remember, we spoke about supplementing the actual public input discussions with a few webinars just to provide, a bit of a 101 on what it is that we're doing as a working group in, identifying this criteria to define communities as being disadvantaged under the law. So, so we'll want to calendar those as soon as we can. You know, so the DEC team is, you know, currently pulling together all of the pieces that need to be pulled together on their end to be ready for scheduling, and then you know, part of what we'll do in the, you know, lead up to the consensus building meeting here is, you know, we're pulling together the materials that would go out for public comment and input. So we'll be looking to finalize those as we finalize decisions on the DAC criteria and scenarios. Any other questions or comments on the schedule? And I just want to point out, so we do have 4 working group members who are not available for this meeting, so we will be following up with them separately to make sure that everybody's aware of the schedule here that's being contemplated, and give them an opportunity to provide input. I guess the last thing just to emphasize here, I know a number of you have already filled out the doodle poll that Alana has sent, but if you could by Tuesday, please fill that out so that way we can schedule the rest of the meetings. And if you don't have the poll handy, if you want us to resend it, just shoot a note over and we can resend it. Thanks, everyone. Okay, Andrea, would you mind moving to the next slide? So I'm going to turn it over to Amanda and Alex in a minute, but just to kind of, you know, revisit the agenda we went through at the beginning of the meeting today. We want to really kind of focus on some of the open questions that we still have in this work. So, you know, through the conversation, we want to kind of focus and kind of emphasize the need for us to kind of think about, you know, how we're thinking about geographic balance, you know, when it comes to disadvantaged communities. So, you know, what percentage of the state is ultimately going to be designated as meeting the criteria for a disadvantaged community. We want to also think about options to ensure that we're reaching and including more lower income households in the criteria. So I know that's been a point of concern for a number of working group members as we start to think about, you know, the geographic parameters for, you know, the criteria, what that could mean in terms of our ability to, you know, include or exclude, you know, unintentionally individuals that are lower income. We also want to think about, you know, the relative importance of different indicators. So whether that's socio-demographic and health vulnerabilities, and kind of, you know, in relation to environmental burdens and climate risks. So I know Amanda and Alex are ready to dig in on that one. And then, you know, more than anything today, we want to make sure that, you know, you all have a chance to kind of, you know, give your opinion and give your thoughts on kind of where we are, you know, in the process. So how close are we when it comes to, you know, landing on a set of criteria that makes sense for you? What do we need to make sure we are addressing that we haven't addressed, or, you know, what questions do you have that we haven't been able to answer yet before we actually go forward with the voting on the scenarios in mid-November? So those are the, you know, the 4 big areas that we want to make sure we touch on today. But if there are any other open questions in your minds that are not reflected here, you know, let's take a minute and identify those before we jump in. Okay, so, you know, along the way, I'm sure there'll be some questions or thoughts that you have, so please make sure you elevate those and put those on the table. So Amanda, Alex, I'll turn it over to you to start the conversation on kind of how far we've come and, you know, dig into the materials here.
Amanda, did you want me to give you the presenter ball now?
Sure.
Okay.
And I might let Alex start talking us through this slide.
Sure. You know, it's funny because we started this process quite a while ago, but I did want to take us through like the crazy amount of things that we have done in this process, which is a lot, and also articulate really why it's so hard to do. And I would like for you all to kind of keep this in mind because it's still really hard and it's going to be an imperfect solution, I think. As we go through it, we just need to optimize it, make it as good as possible. So, you know, at the start, we started by trying to identify all the data and indicators that we could potentially get. We got those then after what, about 130 or so that were identified. We prioritized certain ones, downloaded them, also worked to create kind of ones that didn't have the data the way we needed it, to work with a GIS team to create the data we needed, then go through and review the indicators in a statistical fashion, kind of looking at the quality of the indicator, the data that we have, how they're interrelated and the coverage of them. Then we started creating a tool in Tableau to start visualizing both the individual indicators and then how they start to combine. And then also we made you guys all go through the tough thing of ground truthing, thinking about the areas that you know of in New York State and whether you feel like just viscerally whether they're a DAC or not, and explaining why. And that explaining why, frankly, was really, really informative to us and continues to be. So this is something that throughout today, even just be like, well, that doesn't feel right because of X, Y, and Z. That's incredibly useful for us because then we can take that and start adjusting different levers that we can pull as far as weights or combinations of things. And that's really what we've done with that data. Then what we started doing, once we started combining things and getting closer to what we felt like was a relatively okay DAC designation, was to start seeing, well, what pieces of data, which indicators are the things that are driving the decision? And does that jive with how you all throughout this process have been describing disadvantaged communities? We wanted to make sure that those lined up. And then we've been trying to just drill down closer and closer. So we've been making changes to factor weights and kind of what feeds into their criteria to make sure that we're really getting close to it. The next things, and then in the next couple of meetings, what's really going to get, I think, tough, right? It's been a data-driven approach so far. With a lot of your feedback, is to now start making some decisions about the trade-offs in those decisions. So, you know, are we going to designate 40% of the census tracts in New York State as DACs, or is it going to be 30%, or is it going to be somewhere in between, or something more? Those are some of the decisions that we need to make. How do we incorporate, if we decide to, individual criteria into this decision? All of these different layers are the really tough decisions that we're going to have to make now. And as with all of this, part of it's what's making it so hard is that most of the time, whenever we've made something like this, made some kind of tool, made some kind of designation, we've had other things to check it with. But we're literally creating something that hasn't been created before. So, you know, next year we can compare any tweaks and changes to the one we've done this year. But this year we are creating this, and we have to create it by cobbling together some other comparisons. The ground truthing, PIJA designation, other different areas where we're looking at the percent of different race or ethnicity kind of groups within census tracts, or income, the level of income within census tracts. All of these different things are ways that we're trying to like make the decisions. And that's really hard. So I just want to kind of acknowledge that that is not an easy solution, or it's not an easy process to go through. But the coming meetings are going to be tough in that we're going to have to start making some decisions, debating the trade-offs. And then what Amanda and I will do as a team I think is to internalize, as we've tried to do all the time, internalize your feedback and your thoughts and try to come up with some different scenarios that you can reflect back to. Okay, so next slide. Amanda, I'll hand it to you.
Sure. So really what we have in today's presentation is the pre-read packet. It's the same information. And we put this together as a review for everyone for your own time. I know it's a lot of content. So in that, it starts with a legislative review that I'll just skim over a little bit today. So it talks about the role of the working group and other agencies in creating this criteria and how it will be used. So for the purposes of co-pollutant reductions, greenhouse gas emissions reductions, regulatory impact statements, and allocation of investments. We have been talking a lot about the 40% allocation investments, but this could be interesting to revisit to think about some of the other purposes of this definition. And then we're really all pretty familiar with what we've been calling the 3 different pillars of the criteria that are outlined, and all of our indicators have really been designed to represent these pillars, plus several additional criteria that we've discussed. So areas burdened by cumulative environmental pollution and other hazards, areas with concentrations of people that are low income, high unemployment, high rent burden, low home ownership, et cetera, or members of groups that have historically experienced discrimination, and areas vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And those really turned into, we're really still using these in our framework, the framework we've been seeing of environmental burdens and climate risks, kind of touch on, the first and third pillars. What are the kind of conditions people face in their environments or from climate, and then our other component, which is population and health characteristics, is really this middle pillar of people and health. I think we're all pretty familiar with this, what we've been calling the 40% benefits goal, that sets a minimum threshold of no less than 35% of the overall benefits of spending to disadvantaged communities, and a goal of 40%. And just want to note, the working group has definitely discussed several times that this 40% is really a goal that could be considered a minimum. And also the working group has discussed, that all these communities that might not be designated as disadvantaged communities are still eligible for the remaining 60% of the funds. And these numbers kind of become important as we start to think about the designation threshold and what percentage of the state might it make sense to designate. Designating less than 40% might mean, okay, maybe, more than proportional spending might be targeted or allocated there, though that's fewer areas. Or designating more disadvantaged communities, more than 40% covers more of the state, but doesn't set up necessarily that pressure to direct higher than proportional funding. And again, there's really no right answer, and there's this, as Alex said, kind of visceral sense of what's right once we really start looking at the maps. And finally, we've talked about this a few times, but just calling this out again, that the CLCPA does provide this opportunity for annual review and iteration, letting us know that this is just the first iteration. We still have a lengthy public comment process where the definition could change after that, and then the opportunity for annual review led by you to look at the criteria, the methods, and the data, and determine if modifications are needed. So any kind of thoughts, ideas after kind of looking at the legislation again? Anyone want to bring up? Okay. And now we can really dive into what's been going on with the disadvantaged communities criteria and the scoring method. In our last meeting, we talked about a lot of analysis that happened in August. So what we did in August is take a lot of the feedback we heard in late July and really see what was driving the scenarios and what some of the implications were, where and how many low to moderate income communities were falling in the criteria if we were covering certain areas that were important to you. So in August, we really took feedback from prior meetings and developed alternative scenarios. So I'll just go through some of these to kind of bring us all up to speed on what the current scenarios look like and why. So just to kind of review everything that's informed the changes, there's so much happening, you know, just looking at the data itself, continuing to dig into the data, QA the data, see what's, if the data is really representing what we think it is. Our team has been doing a lot of statistical diagnostics along with DEC to understand what's driving the scores and understanding if the things, you know, you want to see driving the scores are really driving the scores. Also really thinking about the legislation and the criteria that are listed in the legislation. Along the way, throughout the process, we've received a lot of technical expert input from public health, epidemiology, folks at the DOH, from climate risk professionals at NYSERDA and the Department of State, a lot of support from the DEC to really help us understand what data is available to represent disadvantaged communities and how to use it. And then, you know, this group, we've been doing a lot over what seems like almost a year. I think we'll have to have a celebration at some point. Understanding, you know, what disadvantaged communities mean to you and what some of their priorities are. And that has been really that analogy of peeling back the layers of the onion and starting, you know, at a high level of what's important. And then as you start to see things, you know, discussing more and more of actually, you know, I think this is what, you know, this community should be a disadvantaged community and why. And that discussion has really helped to reveal this underlying sense of what should be a disadvantaged community. And we've been kind of tailoring the criterion definition based on that. And the other thing that's been amazing is being able to look at maps and hear your input in ground truthing on what communities you know, make sense to have be disadvantaged communities. So that's been one input. I know, you know, there is some analytical component where we do sometimes look at, you know, agreement with the ground truthing, but just wanted to reiterate here that that's just really just one of multiple inputs. And the big thing from ground truthing isn't necessarily the specific community, but why. The reason you think that community should be included is its sociodemographics, health vulnerabilities, working conditions, living conditions, proximity to a hazardous facility, climate risks. That's really what's helping us refine the methodology. So any questions on kind of our approach so far and how we're, you know, informing the scores at this point? Okay, so here we go, deep into this documentation here of things that we really looked at more deeply in August based on feedback. So here's kind of the main considerations we made and changes we make. And the second column is what we heard in July and previous meetings. Is someone trying to speak? I hear a mic on. Okay. Some typing twice. I don't know if there's anyone who's typing who could mute. Thank you. Okay, so a big thing we've heard over and over is really making sure the scores emphasize income. So that's an important characteristic. And also making sure we're including many low to moderate income areas. And if some are excluded, why? So those first two things and the big things we've looked at. What we learned when we did do some diagnostics in August is, in fact, the scores were and continue to be very heavily driven by income, race, ethnicity, asthma, and renter status. And that's really by design, how we've set up the factors and weighted things, and also because of the strong correlations and the multiple variables we have that represent these different things. That said, one of the big things we're seeing is, even though the scores are very highly driven by those things, we have multiple indicators of each of those things. There still are some low to moderate income areas that are not included in this definition. And that really has to do with this multivariate, multi-factor approach. We have 40 plus variables in here representing different things. A lot of them are correlated with income, but some are not. And another thing that we're doing here, in order to address the three different pillars of the legislation, we are also considering environmental burdens and climate risks. And the approach we've taken so far that follows on California's approach is really this multiplicative approach of looking at all of the factors related to environmental burdens and risks and all of the factors related to population and health, and saying, okay, you know, those are some of the threats and risks people face, and these are kind of demographic and health characteristics that affect people's ability to adapt, respond to those kind of risks. So the idea that, you know, population and health characteristics are kind of an effect modifier, it's called. And how that's been implemented in this score, as has been done in other places, is to actually multiply those two things. And so what that means is the areas that are being designated as disadvantaged communities now generally have both high population and health vulnerabilities and relatively higher environmental and climate burden. So what can happen is, if there's an area that has high population, health, or social vulnerabilities, but doesn't necessarily have environmental and climate risks or burdens in terms of the indicators we have, when those two things are considered together, they're not showing up in the disadvantaged communities list. And, you know, that's kind of, it's part of, you know, the challenge of really trying to have an approach that considers such a wide range of things. So what we've done so far is simply expand that designation threshold to include more tracks. We also did do some work to restructure our factors just a little bit more to put even more emphasis on income. But that said, you know, even with that expansion and even with higher weighting, as you'll see in this deck, you know, there's still some low to moderate income areas that are not currently included. And part of what we're working up to is finding, okay, we've heard this is really important. We know all these other important things. Other things are important too. Let's kind of get through this and kind of reassess where we are. Are we okay with the number or locations of the low to moderate income areas that are not included today? Or do you want to take additional steps or make additional adjustments to include either more low to moderate income areas, or possibly include low to moderate income households, even if they don't fall in DAX? So we'll show some analysis that builds us up to that point of figuring out what some of the options are there. And then finally, on the income side, another question we had in the past was, are there really high income tracts that are being included because they have higher environmental and climate burdens? That was a concern that some might be included. So we looked at that and found that there are some, but relatively few higher income tracts, and those that are included appear to have meaningful environmental justice burdens or climate risks. So at this point, we're not really focusing so much on, you know, the exclusion of potential high income areas, but really this question of, how do we all feel about the current low to moderate income areas that are included and options there? So questions, thoughts on the income side of things?
I have a question, Amanda. This is Abby, for the record. Thank you, Chris. Yeah, so my question is just like kind of a matter of degrees, right? Like when you say LMI areas, is this a very low income area? You know, are these very low income areas that are being excluded? Or are they ones that are kind of on the, you know, in the middle? And same on the other side with the higher income tracts. Are these like really high income tracts, or are they also kind of falling in the middle?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I guess along with that, it I think would be helpful for us to actually be able to see, like, for these ones that are kind of questionable, like the specific details on these tracts.
Mm-hmm. We have a way to do that, and that can be something that when we get to maps, Alex can guide us through a few of those communities. We've also kind of quantified on the low to moderate income side exactly how many in, you know, meeting certain criteria might be excluded. So we'll show that a little bit later as well. And I think some of your other questions about matter of degrees are other dimensions of that we could look into. Yeah, those are important questions. Any other questions or thoughts on the income discussion? Again, we'll go through more details later.
Amanda, this is Chris. Maybe just another way to look at this as well, and maybe this could help inform the way the group wants to go. But you know, there are also scenarios where you know, there are programs that are really kind of dedicated to income eligible households, right? So regardless of where they live in a certain census tract, and it might be worth, if we have the ability to look at you know, maybe like a case study on, you know, a program that is, you know, dedicated towards lower income households, and maybe like where that program is, you know, doing most of its activity, or having most of its activity. So just to get a sense for, like, potentially, you know, depending on how we set the parameters for the DAC, you know, could we be leaving out, you know, additional like low income households, and then I'm not sure how best to think about that, but just as another point of reference, that could be helpful for this conversation. So I think at NYSERDA we have some data that we can share on the Empower program, which, you know, we've done a lot of geocoding of projects under Empower, so we could maybe kind of look at, you know, where Empower projects are falling relative to, you know, the different geographic, parameter scenarios. And that won't be the end all, right? I mean, that'll just be one lens to look at this through, but it could be informative.
Okay, great. Oh, Abby, I really want to get to your question. It's buried pretty deep in these slides, but I hope we're going to get there. For your reference, it's on slide 46. And just to give you the highline before we get there, we kind of found the lowest 20% of income levels, considering both poverty threshold and households making less than 80% of AMI. So considering both of those, and in kind of the 20% of tracts with higher percentages of people in both of those categories, we did find that 91% of tracts are included as DACs. So covering 91%, and excluding, you know, depending on the scenario, between 7 to 10%. So where we are now is really just seeing, you know, that 7 to 10%, how do we feel about those tracts, looking at them, not just their income levels, but other characteristics and vulnerabilities. Would it make sense that those aren't DACs? Do we think they should be DACs? And really, how much do we want to, you know, twist, bend our scenarios to fit them? Do we want to twist and bend what we have? Or do we want to kind of add an additional layer or additional rules to capture them? Or are there ways to kind of think of outside the box, maybe the idea of figuring out how we can reach households in those areas, but not necessarily the whole community?
So since you guys jumped ahead, I'm going to jump ahead. And by the way, I really appreciate the preparation materials that you put together. They were very, very, very helpful. So thank you guys for taking the time to do that. But this question about individual households, I'm super interested in exploring. And like Chris, what you were just mentioning about seeing some of the data, I think would be really helpful. Although, of course, qualifying that with has equal outreach happened in all of these places for people to be able to access the program. So there's like that caveat, I guess. But just one other little thing on this slide that kind of in my mind I'm flagging is the not recommending exclusions. I know one of the other slides that's coming up talks about that it's harder to remove DACs later than to add them. So in a way, this seems inconsistent with that. Does it make sense to exclude these higher income ones to start with, and then later down the line, maybe move them back in would be my thought, but.
That's a great point. And I like how you're thinking about the difficulty of excluding things later, either excluding indicators later, excluding DACs later. So let's think about that as well. I think our thinking there was, we had a previous conversation about, what if they're high income areas that still have a lot of other vulnerabilities or high BIPOC population or very specific environmental burden. So there, I think we would really want to get your input looking deeply at those specific tracks to say, okay, would it, how might those communities react if they were excluded? But at the same time, we could, you could imagine kind of a rule, an income-based rule that could do that if you wanted to.
I do want to
This is Chris again. Oh, I'm sorry, Alex.
Oh, go ahead, Chris.
Just
go
a
ahead.
flag for when we get into this conversation about excluding, or even annually as we kind of go and kind of assess the criteria and calibrate, we'll have to think about the implications just in the field. Like, so if we're talking about, there's the potential that there are projects that are multi-year projects, multi-year investments that happen, and the decision is happening in kind of year one, but if in year two we're changing the criteria, that also would have some complications for for this process. So I guess we'll need to keep that in mind as well.
I think that's such a great point about how does this get built out, and that relates to how big we set the designation threshold now too. Is there any value in kind of starting smaller now with the ability to add? So not that we need to follow this approach at all, but California, for example, really started with only a geographic definition where they took the top 25% of communities based on the Cal and Virus Screen score. And then over time, they built in low to moderate income communities. So just an LMI community component without considering other characteristics, and then low to moderate income households. So the ability to serve low to moderate income households, which kind of expanded the the number of eligible people in households, but kind of did that over time. Alex, did you want to say anything here?
Well, there's, I guess it's just that this is one of those things where there's no clear right or wrong answer, nor is there a clear definitive approach. Just like Amanda's saying, like there are so many different ways of trying to get to this spot. So as we go forward in the coming weeks, what I'd urge each and every one of you is to think about, like, what is the most vital thing that you're seeing in your area? How are we capturing that? And what can we do, or what are your ideas or thoughts on how to capture that, right? Is it an individual addition? Is it a different way of combining the scores? There are so many different ways of doing this that it's almost overwhelming. But the trick is, like, you can leave the methods as far as like the math part to us. What we need, particularly from this group, is the policy thinking and the implications, just like what Chris said, as far as like the multi-year implications, the policy implications, and then weighing those as a pro and con. You know, if we have a larger percent designated now, what does that mean in the coming years? If we exclude those with high EJ, like high climate burdens and risks, what does that mean for those groups? Are they able to respond even if they have those high ones? You know, the answer could be yes, it could be no. So all of that, I think, is one of those things, as we've all witnessed this year, climate impacts and shocks are happening much more frequently, and we're seeing how different areas are going to be able to respond or not. And in the coming years, that is, I think, something that's going to be of profound importance for us to be analyzing and looking at as well. Right. So I want us to take the long view thinking about this, but also particularly from your side, I'd like for you to be thinking about the policy implications, because that should drive your decision making on this. And we can deal with the sciencey parts of it, the math and the addition parts of it, and we'll meet in the middle.
Thanks. So that was great. I know it feels like we've been on this slide for a while, but those were all very necessary things to talk about, and really talked about some of the big topics we need to, keep talking about later in this presentation. Is anyone typing? I see a little chat dot moving. Does anyone want to add anything? Okay. So I might move quickly through the next slides, which are more review of some of the changes we made last time in terms of the factor structure and the indicator list. Those have already kind of been made and discussed last time, and weren't really hugely significant changes. They helped and improved things, but weren't kind of ground shifting changes. So I'll kind of leave these in here for your review. As we've been talking about, one of the decisions still ahead is what percentage of the state should be designated. So far, we have expanded the definition a little bit, and we're still looking at various scenarios that are capturing about 35 to 45% of the census tracts in the state as disadvantaged communities. And that's an ongoing thing to discuss here, and this kind of lays out pros and cons. And then the next few slides are about, just an update on what the current kind of factor structure is, this idea of environmental burdens and climate change risks as some of the conditions that people experience and face, and population characteristics and health vulnerabilities. And so I just want to call out here, and this is kind of an inherent part of our approach here, since these two things are multiplied, for this kind of effect modifier idea, they essentially have equal influence. In any scenarios that we're using things on both sides of this page, they essentially have equal influence. So even when really, does someone have a question? Okay. Even when we play with or change weights, we might change, we've increased the weights of our income variables and our race and ethnicity variables within those two factors, change the weights of the factor. Even when we play with things within one of these things, when they get multiplied together, they kind of have similar influence. And that's relevant when we start to look at the maps and what we're starting to hear, what we think we're hearing that we want to change with you, discuss with you as when we're ground truthing out. A lot of what we think we've been hearing is high consideration of population characteristics and health vulnerability. So really thinking of whether a community is a disadvantaged community based on, people, sociodemographics, income, race and ethnicity, things like that. So we're kind of hearing that rise to the surface as something that, might in some cases be more important than specific environmental burden. So I wanted to call that out as part of this discussion of what are some of the trade-offs if we do want to include more low to moderate income households. What are some of the trade-offs? Are we going to be able to do that if we give the same and equal consideration to environmental burdens and climate risks? And again, it's really hard to answer in the abstract, so I'm trying to move us to the point of kind of looking at some options and maps that we've developed to help think about these trade-offs. And I'll just review some of the changes we made in August. We did look at some of the correlations between indicators and what were driving things and what might not be needed because there's other things that are similar and represent them. You know, we do think there's kind of a benefit of trying to streamline the list a little bit because having extra indicators that are correlated with each other that already have something else in the tool that's representing the same thing can kind of muddy or mute the effects of other indicators. So we have some indicators that I would consider kind of more unique standalone indicators that we only have one thing that represents that concept, like manufactured or mobile homes. We have other things that might be highly correlated where we have multiple things doing the same things. And the more of them we have, it makes it, you know, more challenging for something like manufactured or mobile homes, the effect of that to rise to the surface. So that was kind of the reasoning. We removed two things and added a % Asian to race and ethnicity. So not huge changes here. I also want to note here, this hasn't been discussed in a while, and we can definitely discuss it more in the future if you'd like to. And David Witt's here today to discuss this as well. Currently, we're automatically including 19 census tracts that are kind of documented to be tribal and indigenous areas. So these include federally designated reservation territory and tracts with nation-owned land. So either, you know, census or federally designated or are identifiable in New York State and parcel data. So this is a list of these areas that are currently being automatically included. Any questions, thoughts for David or others? Okay, and feel free to connect with anyone after and let us know if this is a topic you'd like to keep talking about. And finally, I just want to note, in some cases, we often see some gaps in the maps where they're not necessarily classified as a DAC or a non-DAC. And throughout the process, we've been setting aside 138 tracts that have populations that are too low for reliable people and household data. So basically the census data can't really represent the people living there well. These are sparsely populated areas, as well as group quarters like correctional facilities, where there just isn't, you know, data from the census on things like household income. So currently these aren't in the scoring system, just, you know, to help us look at, troubleshoot, understand the scoring system, but there is a plan to include these on the basis of environmental burdens and climate risks alone. So though we don't have data on the population and health side, we can look at, you know, whether their burden score is higher than a certain threshold. So any questions on what we just discussed? Okay. So the next section is really getting into some new scenarios. Actually, one new scenario we have to look at today. So now we're at the point of, in the past, we've really been showing just one scenario to really get focused feedback and say, let's look at one particular area and look at whether it makes sense for this community to be designated as a disadvantaged community or not. And as you heard, the scenario we've developed is, you know, based on a lot of iteration, and so it's scenario one here on this slide is the scenario that we developed in August that we've discussed. So it includes all of the indicators and indicator list. has this multiplicative approach, and what that gives us is a pretty balanced representation, at least balanced data-wise, of environmental burdens and climate change risks and population and health vulnerability. So kind of this theory-driven scenario that represents all of the data, but still weights the data and categorizes the data to capture the things that the group has really emphasized in the past. So scenario one really does still show that income, race, ethnicity, asthma, and other health effects, renter status are still huge drivers and very highly correlated with disadvantaged communities here. And then scenario two, which Alex will talk more about, is something we developed to really reflect what we've been hearing in these past few meetings. As you kind of ground truth and respond to the scenarios, we've been hearing a lot of description of disadvantaged communities in terms of income, race, ethnicity, language, health impacts, living and working conditions, and some of the resources available to respond to climate threats and to recover from climate change shocks. So we really just wanted to look at, really for discussion purposes, to spark some discussion, what would happen if we really did emphasize these things and we really didn't look at environmental burdens and climate change risks for a moment, just as an exercise to see what this could look like, to see if actually this might be closer to representing some of the things we've heard you prioritize. So this is really a scenario that is meant to spark discussion among the group to see things without environmental or climate considerations and build us up to this consideration of, how we might be able to reach more areas with a population health or other social vulnerabilities. Alex, do you want to say anything more about how this came to be?
I think you said it. I think when Amanda and I come out of these meetings, we often have some brainstorming sessions based on what we've heard from you. And every time that we've talked about or looked at maps together, what we're hearing are some references to physical things. So on the kind of environmental side, but almost everything is about the people side, the population, the health side, ramifications of some of those physical things. And frankly, what we wanted to see then is, okay, well, what happens if we exclude the physical things and go just for the socio-demographic and health things? And does that shift our perspective on what counts or not? And part of this is because we can't multiply, we can't make, with this multiplicative approach, we can't make the population and health vulnerabilities matter twice as much. As that kind of large weighting thing, right? That just exacerbates everything. I had a moment of relearning math to get to that point. What that means then is that we have to be a little bit creative or change our multiplication kind of approach to try to look at this. So this is our way of saying, okay, well, what if we exclude the environmental components? Let's look at the combined thing and what do we learn? So that's what we're going to go through today.
This just shows what that is in math terms.
See the zeros? That second scenario basically zeroes out that whole orangey thing.
And we'll keep going so we can talk about some of the maps and implications. Alex, do you want to pick up here?
Sure. Yeah. So we've talked about kind of one of the biggest levers we have, which is to, we can designate more tracks as DACs. In this case, what we did was take that, that combined part and designate at least 30% in each kind of the combination rest of state or New York only kind of combination. And in that combination with this, we get 37 or 38% of the tracks designated as a DAC. And I'm just going to skip through these because these haven't changed. So insofar as what we've talked about as far as changing different elements, the indicators within them have not changed. So we can go forward. We added % Asian and we did weight Latino and Black within race and ethnicity higher. So that's the only kind of nuance there. Okay. If we go to the next one. Now, we didn't get a lot of time last time to go through some of these different areas, but the idea here is that we've got a couple diagnostic tables which will help us to kind of distinguish between the two different scenarios across things. And in this case, that table on the left here really shows the regional breakdown of the percent of tracks in New York City that are designated a DAC overall. And it lets us see if we do change this S2, this scenario 2 is only the vulnerability side of things. And what does that shift? How does that shift things down? And it was interesting to us to look through this and be like, okay, if you exclude the environmental burdens and threats in that side, you get a larger proportion of DACs in Long Island. And then if going down here, you get more in the southern tier and more in North Country, slightly fewer in New York City. And some of the other urban areas, which was not what we expected, frankly, in that this takes into account both racial and income kind of components and weighs them more within scenario 2, right? So it's an interesting shift for us. If you want to go to the next one. And also, as you all know, please interrupt me, talk, ask questions. The other thing that we wanted as far as a diagnostic table was to look at the scenarios as the percent of different groups of interest and different kind of metrics that we're trying to track and understand throughout this. So if you're a DAC, in both scenarios, there's a larger proportion of those that are in poverty, 100% or less than federal poverty income. That's high. 24% are those, that's the average kind of scoring of the tracks within that, right? And then what I'm looking at here is not just a comparison between DAC and non-DAC for each scenario, but I'm also looking at the comparison between DAC scores, the average score for 80% AMI between scenario 1 and scenario 2. What's interesting here is that there's actually not huge differences. There's about a 2% average difference between Black and African American in scenario 2, which is a little bit higher, but not a huge amount. A little bit more poverty being caught. Again, a little bit more lower middle income being caught with scenario 2, but again, not a huge amount more. Because we've zeroed out the burden score in this one, you don't get the average score in the scenario 2 because it doesn't exist mathematically. Any questions so far?
And let us know if you want to look at the previous slide again. I know there's a lot on the regional side. Actually, let me just pull that back up for a second if we want to look at the left a little bit more, because the regional shift, was significant in some areas. Okay.
One of the things that we've been also trying to do is to understand the breakdown of where the DACs are going. Are they rural? Are they suburban? Are they urban? And looking at them, we've got the percent statewide of the population. So 17% of tracks in New York State are rural, designated rural, 33% suburban, 49% urban. And then what we wanted to do was just like, well, what are the scenarios? How are they breaking down? And slightly more designations in urban for both, slightly fewer in the suburban region, and slightly fewer in the rural region for both. There's not a lot of difference between the scenarios. They all kind of jive that way.
And I think one point, there's a lot of text on the left that you can take a look at is we did try to make numerous adjustments to allow some of the rural indicators that we included to have more influence, and reduce some of the other variables to make more room for them. However, even making these adjustments, even trying to cut down on variables that are common and more correlated in urban areas, we're still seeing proportionally fewer rural areas classified as disadvantaged communities. So question here, again, there is no right or wrong answer. Using the data that we have, more urban areas, relatively more urban areas are getting classified as DAC. So this urban 51% is saying that of all of the areas in New York State that are classified as urban, about 51% in these scenarios would be designated as a disadvantaged community. And that number is much lower right now for rural areas. It's showing that of all the tracts designated as rural in New York State, which is about 17% of the state. Of all those areas, about 13% in either scenario would be classified as a disadvantaged community. And there's no right or wrong. I mean, there's very different characteristics here. So kind of our question as people start looking at the maps is, when you really look at specific rural tracts, how does that feel to you? Looking at specific tracts, are enough rural tracts being classified, and do you think those that aren't generally are more or less disadvantaged?
I have a question, and this is maybe it's more so for the other working group members that are much better versed in what's going on in rural New York. Is anyone able to explain maybe the reasoning why so many rural areas might be left out? Like, what does that mean about their characteristics that the inclusion is only 13%?
I can help Sonal to answer that. I think that there are a number of reasons why that's happening, and I can show you on the map what's going on there. Generally speaking, the way that we're adding things up, a lot of rural areas have low income. They don't have a lot of environmental threats, not nearly as much. And so a lot of the things that are in this grouping right here, the climate change risks, there's a little bit of flooding going on in some of the rural areas, but not as much because North Country just doesn't have the Hudson River and other areas there, right? So then you've got land use facilities. We are capturing this when it happens, but there aren't a lot. There's a lot of forested area and not as much as far as active landfills or oil storage facilities. So a lot of this is not happening. And then if you go back to the vulnerability side of things, there is low income happening. We're definitely seeing some lower income areas, but you don't see the health impacts as much. And what we've started to really see, especially for the lower income tracts that are not necessarily being designated as a DAC, even with just the vulnerability scenario, it's because they have fewer health impacts. So yes, they're low income, but they don't have the health impacts that we heard are very important. And I think are really, really important, right? So asthma, low birth weight, all of these different elements that are in that factor matter a lot within this larger component and factor.
Yeah, I mean, some things, COPD looks like can be higher in rural areas. Adults age 65 plus can be higher, but I think what we're seeing is we have selected pointedly a number of variables where we do think they're higher in rural areas, but given the number of variables, there's so many other indicators that tend to be higher in urban areas, and we have multiple correlates of them. So the sheer number of things that are kind of more correlated in urban areas is kind of balancing things out a little bit. Also, lower percentages of BIPOC households and populations in rural areas. And then on the right, what we're seeing is some of these indicators were kind of intentionally included to represent rural areas more. So housing cost burden and energy cost burden can both be high, manufactured homes, older homes, percent without internet. But even with those things, those are kind of what I'm calling more those unique indicators that there's just kind of one thing that represents that. Then you see, you know, with a number of other indicators, those are, you know, kind of getting, don't have as much of an impact, just considering that, you know, the many factors we're trying to include.
Yeah, they're not very predictive, or at least they don't kind of come in as much. So there's a lot less kind of real world weight on them. We can add it up, but it doesn't really shift a lot. So Sonal, you kind of, we spent a lot of time trying to like figure that out, right? So we're like, wait, what's going on in this area? And if you go to the next slide, this one I thought was really interesting. Oh, come back. When we looked at the regional distribution and we looked at just S2, this is where we started seeing a little bit of a shift, not necessarily in the proportion overall of rural regions that were getting designated a DAC, but frankly, the placement of those designations. So the North Country has a much higher proportion with just the second scenario, with just looking at those vulnerabilities. And then the Southern Tier also. And so what was interesting to us there is like, okay, so income is popping more there. There's some that being able to reduce down those environmental indicators, well, basically eliminate them, lets some of those areas shine. Like, right, we're able to designate more of them, but it doesn't shift.
Alex, your sound cut out. I don't know if anyone else has that.
Work. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, you said it doesn't shift.
It doesn't shift the overall rural, urban, suburban kind of areas, which, you know, like, again, is it wrong, is it right kind of component is really what we're starting to try to figure out. That's where the ground truthing comes. That's where your gut feeling comes in. What I don't want us to do is to like hang our hats solely on the statistics of the breakdown, because it needs to be more than that. The statistics are great in summary, but they don't show distributions. They don't show the whole shape of what we're looking at. And the maps really are a better tool for us to start looking at, okay, well, in this area, what's going on and what are we capturing? And if we look at another track right by it, does it look right that this is designated and this isn't?
So that takes me to the follow-up question, which is, are we able, the map, are we able to select for just this second scenario to see what it looks like?
Yeah, we've color coded it. It's going to be a little bit of a brain thing to go through it. And we'll get to it, actually. We can kind of go through some of the other stuff as we go. And maybe I should just jump there after the next slide so you can see it and we can talk through the differences between them. So the ground truthing on this one, what was really interesting, and again, it kind of responded back to how you all are speaking of what makes a DAC. The S2 agreement, which is just vulnerabilities, has a much higher ground truthing agreement with you all. You know, when you take out some of the other components. So we thought that was interesting. We're not, again, hanging our hats on this. It's just more of that's an interesting idea. Okay, gonna switch to the next one. Let's continue on this. I think that we talked through some of those different parts. And so you'll see here, I've got a bunch of different ones, and we'll just actually hop to the map soon, but we've got 3 different colors. Well, 4. You've got the white, which is not designated a DAC. You've got the red, which means that there's agreement between the first scenario and the second scenario. Those are like core, right? They're there. You've got yellow, which is basically if they have the environmental components in them, that's just S1. So in my brain, when I think about, I want to look at those that are designated a DAC from scenario 1, I look at the red and I look at the yellow combined. And then if I want to look at what differences we see with just the second scenario, just those vulnerabilities, that's the blue being added in. So let's jump to the map. Amanda, can you throw me the ball? Okay. Let me share my screen. And share. And then you all, let's see here, scenario comparison. You can do it. Okay, here we go. This map now has a lot more complexity to it. We've got the diagnostic tables that you all can see. So we've got all of that. We can change the big levers of how much percentage of the whole state we want to designate. And on the bottom here, you'll see two different things. One is the orange and the kind of teal, the X's and the dots are where we got information about ground truthing from you all. And so we've actually gotten a pretty good swath of ground truthing, which has been very helpful. And then this crazy table right here is just meant to show that the second scenario, that blue scenario, has nulled out the environmental vulnerability, or sorry, the burdens on that side. So you just can be clear about that. But everything else is as we have seen it and talked about so far. So Sonal, if we talk through kind of what we see up here visually, you just see a lot more blue than what we had before with just that vulnerabilities only scenario. And if I go through and kind of talk through what we're seeing here is we had captured through just the first scenario with the environmental part, some of the ground truthing here. But we got a new one here with the second scenario, right? It's got a higher vulnerability percentile. And it had a low burden percentile, which means the environmental areas were low. But we had high poverty in this area, low diversity. And so it wasn't popping if you just had that first scenario. And that's kind of true for a lot of these. You can just clearly see that there's a lot more lower income areas that then kind of pop out in the North Country because of income in this area. And in comparison, there's some ones that just don't quite fit as much that aren't designated. So it's actually kind of an interesting combination. One thing I will say is if we go over to by Fort Drum, we're still not getting some of these areas, this ground truth area, these areas right here. And part of that is that they're actual military bases, if I remember correctly. And so we're getting the surrounding areas where we have a bit more of the kind of, you could see the income, and you can also see some of the burdens also popping there. This tract right here is very low income, so it gets designated a DAC if we use just the vulnerability side. But we're still not capturing these, and part of that is because the burden is so low and the income is not as low as some of the surrounding areas. So, I'm not sure that we're actually wrong in this insofar as what these look like to me. Even if, so again, it's not the end all be all. We're not trying to train everything to be just by the ground truth areas. It does give us something to focus on. So I actually want to hear from you all what you think, where you would like to go in this. We have, because of this, actually thought of a creative solution to integrate both of these areas, and that is, well, what's stopping us from including this combination where you have this scenario 1, but then you also add all of those DACs that are scenario 2. And that, in essence, kind of does that end run around, how can I put this? The end run around our inability to make this vulnerability large factor component score more important. We're in essence doing that by taking the combination of the red, the yellow, and the blue and saying, hey, all of you are now DACs. How does that look and feel? It makes about 42% of all, right now if we keep the threshold the way it is, a DAC. Give you all a minute to go through that one. I'm going to go to New York City. One of the reasons why we were trying to do this was looking at Sunset Park and trying to understand what was going on with Sunset Park, why we weren't capturing certain things. Let's see here. And no matter what we played around with, we weren't able to capture most of Sunset Park, or at least some of the ground truth areas, with just including the environmental and the vulnerability side of things. Any questions so far? Okay, I was just going to jump to Buffalo, so let's go there. Rawa, be prepared.
I'm here. I'm ready.
Okay. We thought this was actually quite interesting. That a lot of Buffalo is captured irrespective of which scenario you get at. But you start seeing some differences. You start seeing some areas over here that are captured when you include the environmental burden side of things. And then you get some, again, that are captured just with the vulnerability side. So I wanted to see, I can zoom in more if you'd like,
I was going to say,
whether you're feeling like we're missing things.
Yeah. If you could zoom in on that first yellow that's like closest to the water.
That one? Okay.
Yeah. Because I can't, is that coming up as a DAC or no?
Yeah, so anything with a color on it that's not white is coming up as a DAC.
Okay,
So,
then can you move
what?
That is definitely, it's hard for me to see exactly. Oh, some of it definitely, yeah, some of it is not a DAC. So it's like most of downtown Buffalo, right? And so there's like a lot of commercial, office buildings and things like that that I don't think would be considered a DAC. But there is some housing like near some of these areas. Yeah, in particular, like around Elm Street.
Right around here.
Yeah, but it makes sense that it's showing up as a DAC on the environmental side of things because of its proximity to Bethlehem Steel and a lot of old manufacturing places that have closed, including grain elevators and things like that.
Yeah, it's got a very high burden percentile here of 83% on the average of that, and so that's pretty high, and why it's popping over. And then you start looking at other areas where the median income right next to it very, very low, and that one's agreed upon with both scenarios.
Yeah, so those make sense. I guess my frustration with this map right now is there's just a lot of commercial and other types of businesses that are in that yellow area that have to be teased out from the residential.
Yep. And that's actually, you bring up kind of a good policy element to this, right? So we're doing this based on the data that we have, and so it's a residential area, or we're taking residential data for the vulnerabilities component of it, and then we're taking in all this industrial and climate-related, pollution-related data points, which are going to make these more industrial areas pop in this type of scenario. But it still has, 70% for those that live there. It still has a pretty high poverty rate.
Yep.
And so, I think that this is just the reality of it being a census tract. So the policy element to me makes me start thinking, well, this is one of those places where as these different programs and the funding gets moved to these areas, how does it get invoked? What happens? What do you do with it? So that's outside of the DAC designation, but to me, that's what I'm hearing from you is that's going to be a policy implication for, this to me seems like a very legitimate DAC, but not all the areas within it are DACs. And I think that we're going to encounter that more and more.
Again, so I advocate not to you, Dr. Dunn, but to the state agencies. This is why I think we're going to need some type of advisory board or community-based something or other in these different regions to answer these questions in real time as investments are happening. Because I imagine that it's not unique to Buffalo, where you have like, a couple of blocks that could be really absolutely designated. And of course, as I said, the environmental degradation and brownfields are very real. But then, you have like incredible law offices and, all kinds of Buffalo elite living in this like very specific area that isn't showing up right now. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag, you know what I mean? And it really could be building by building, block by block difference of should investments go there or not go there.
Yeah, policy-wise, I think really important to discuss and think through.
And then if we can move up to where it looks like it's that gray-blue map.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let me go here, and then I'm going to zoom in a tiny bit so that you can see what's going on.
Yeah.
And so you can just see, we've got much higher, less than 80% AMI. Not hugely diverse. There's a burden percentile that's 16, but this is why it's less on the environmental components, but much higher on the vulnerability side.
Yeah, I agree with it, except in particular, as you go up to more of like the Allentown kind of area too, is this is an area that is also a little bit of kind of a mixed bag. Huge gentrification happening here with the new developments around SUNY going downtown, which is also like near the big medical campus where it's just a huge freaking campus. They're doing all kinds of new buildings. New sort of more affluent folks will be moving into this area in this community. So it's kind of like it's a community in transition. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And again, I think this is where it will really matter because what's going to happen is one of two things is going to happen. Either we just give it a blanket designation that it is a DAC and the investments are going to go there, and there are going to be people that really are going to benefit there that are not, would be considered a vulnerable population or a DAC. And then if we just change it kind of blanketly to say, wow, it's kind of a mixed area, there will be some, I think, individuals that could potentially be under threat of being displaced and what have you, could use these investments to then ensure that that displacement doesn't happen.
Yep. Yeah, I think that, okay, so you've touched on a lot of things that we want to discuss, and that I think, Amanda, if you're taking notes, like I think we should really conceptualize and think through in the coming weeks. And one is, how do we deal with the fact that census tracts are bigger, so that way we're definitely going to be capturing some neighborhoods that really are legitimately not DACs, but there's no way around that. So how do we deal with that then? And so one of the things that we could do is an and thing, where it's like, okay, you're designated a DAC, and then to get the funding, you have to be low income on top of that, which I'm not sure is necessarily what you would want, but it's an option. There's an or thing. If you're not designated a DAC, but you're low income in another area, then you could be. So that kind of is a bigger tent philosophy, then you could be there. But that still lets in these residents that are not low income within a designated DAC area. Then the other concept that I think is
go ahead.
really big is gentrification. And I want us to think about gentrification, but also recognize that given the timing of when we have to create this DAC or this designation for this year, we have to think about gentrification in a couple ways. And one is, we know it's happening. There's actually this fabulous article about how many different cities are trying to capture and understand gentrification, but none of them really overlap very well. It's a really hard concept to actually like mathematically come up and map and show. And so we need to figure out for New York State, policy-wise, way of thinking about it because you all see it, but how do we capture it? Just like a DAC, how do we capture that? And I think that that's a concept that we have to table for a long run kind of way of capturing that in a systematic way, but we still have to discuss it in a more ad hoc way, this way of getting us to think through, if you know of places where the statistics are not necessarily popping up on gentrification, but how can we think about it? What do we adjust? There's just so much there.
Yeah, and I would say if as a Buffalonian living and looking at the streets more closely now, I would not designate this particular community a DAC, maybe a couple of blocks here and there. But for example, that place where it says Delaware Avenue, like near Allen Street and so forth, that's like where you have Millionaires Row and these incredible, beautiful, amazing mansions, you know what I mean? So I look at like College Street, Park Street, Elmwood, Irving, like those are all like none of like around the Theodore inaugural site and Pearl. Those are definitely not DACs. I would say around Public School 48, there's a couple of blocks like that are more west of, what is the street here? West of Elmwood South that could be considered potentially DACs, but they would just be a couple of blocks. As you can see the red then around Caroline and all of that where it really turns into a DAC, right? And so what you have kind of like this community that really is a little bit of an anomaly even for Buffalo when you look at whole neighborhoods, right? But I would say specifically the neighborhood that you had mapped out right there, I would say 90% of it is not a DAC.
Okay, that's good to know. And super helpful, especially as we look at kind of the adjoining areas of this. So this might be something where we tinker with how to capture, you know, because this is, again, not taking into account any of the burden components of it, and that's why it pops across this area. So something to think about and look at.
Sonal,
any other areas, Rafa?
Oh, Alex, I don't know if you can see the chat, but Sonal raised.
I can't.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I was just, when Rava was talking about how she's pointing out a specific place that's changing a lot vis-a-vis gentrification. I was saying, you know, what's important there is where the household level considerations, I think, become really vital, at least in my opinion. You know, that's how you capture, and I think of Harlem in the same way, the areas that We Act works in, it's the same issue, the same concern, is whole census tracts being declared DACs, but these days we have multimillionaires living in those areas too. So I think that's where the household level piece is important. And then also, I was going to bring up the point that I think this is the gentrification concern is one reason why it's important for us to keep revisiting this map over the years as that does change, because what we decide in 2021 might be very different next year.
Yeah, agreed. Living in a currently gentrifying area is really an education into this kind of component of what's going on, and through the years we see it happening in our neighborhood. And I think the way to think about this is also like, we need to ground truth for gentrification. This is not necessarily a DAC initial thing, but we need to ground truth for that now and start getting those data now, so that as we go through the years, we can start looking at how things are shifting, where they're shifting, because there's gradations of this. But there's a theoretical question I'd like to hear from all of you about, and this is just to get a sense of how we can fine tune things in these scenarios. And so I'm going to ask you a question, each of you, I'd like you to answer. If we're thinking about this tract, this Allentown tract right here, in your areas where we have people who clearly are not DACs, but we have some that are, and for some reason in the model, with the data we have, it's certainly popping as a DAC. How, if we separate out, if we don't include this but include an income qualification. Would that work with you, or do we include this but then make it so that the people can't, within this area, can't benefit if they are higher income?
That's a good question, but I would think that maybe the state agencies should answer that, because it's kind of like flip side of a coin, right? Is what is going to be easiest to implement once we adopt this policy? Chris, you got any ideas? You look stressed out. Sorry, Chris.
What? Say that again. So.
Yeah, what would be the easier way of sort of addressing the question that Alex asked, which is, do we say that that area, Allentown, is not a DAC, but if people that income qualify and that live in those blocks can then access resources, or do we leave it as a DAC, but then say that there is an income requirement if people can apply or not? I don't know.
So I'll just give the view from NYSERDA just as an administrator, right? So I think we have some experience with programs like Empower, or even Green Jobs, Green New York, low interest financing, where we've kind of set some geographic parameters to automatically determine eligibility as a way to, like, streamline participation processes for households. But that was really kind of an added process. So it's not like we exclude people from directly applying to the program, but if you live in a community that is included in the automatic eligibility list, we don't have to do any additional income screening. And so I don't think there's anything wrong with, kind of establishing a core group of communities as DACs, and then still being, still having kind of a pathway for, households that, are income eligible to apply to programs. So I think that would be the best outcome if, we don't want to be exclusionary where there are households or residents that would be otherwise income eligible to participate in a program. So does that make sense? And I could give you more examples on how NYSERDA is implementing that for Empower or Green Jobs, Green New York. Maybe not today, but in the next conversation we have, if that makes sense.
Yep.
Or would be helpful.
And Alex, if you could then go to the Elmwood, if you're satisfied with that answer, which I'm totally cool with.
Yes, and I do want to then kind of float the idea, but yeah, let's talk Elmwood first.
Yeah, so I would say that most of this is erroneous. I would say that this is, again, a heavily gentrified community. So where it's gentrifying, and there are definitely still some DACs, and this is where Push's sort of work started, is around Shenango and Ferry and some of those Auburn Bains, right? But I'm telling you, like, it's every other house at this point, where I would say some of them are not. But anything that is east of Richmond, so Richmond Avenue, yep, Ferry,
yeah, right
Norwood,
there.
yeah, Norwood, like those are not DACs. Excuse me. And then Auburn Avenue, Nardin Academy. I have no idea why that is even remotely showing up as a DAC. It's like Nardin Academy and Canisius College are both like very, very posh private schools. There's like a shit ton of mansions and, expensive fresh food markets and things like that all around there. So I'm very confused by that. Where it does begin to shift is Linwood Avenue. That's kind of like a fence line. Linwood itself is not a DAC, but then when you kind of go over to like where it says Oxford and all of that, you begin to see more of a DAC, and then Main Street is a clear line of like haves and have-nots. Main Street, yeah. But like, for example, like Lafayette Avenue up until you get to Main Street, or even like not like Harvard Place around there, definitely not a deck. Chapin Parkway, oh my God, no, absolutely not. St. James Blake, yeah, they're not decks.
Well, I think this is so interesting because, like, if you look at some of this, what's happening here is that you look at the burden score, and because there must be some industrial areas here, that some pollutants that are popping this in, because it doesn't seem like a DAC for clearly most of it, but then there are some things that are pushing it in. You know, it still has a higher percentage Black than average, and it has 41% kind of middle income, lower middle income, less than 80% AMI.
Yeah.
And then, so then but then you go right next to it and you're like, oh, wow. Okay. So in this case, it's clearly a DAC. You've got a 95%, you know, vulnerability percentile score. And so you see this shift there.
But can you do me a
kind of one of those.
Yeah, can you look at Chapin Parkway though? That is the biggest anomaly. Like trust me, there's like no low income people or folks of color living on Chapin Parkway, which is that like
okay, where's that?
Northernmost corner. Yeah.
Right
Do you
here?
see that? Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, it's because, so interesting. Dang it.
Right? I know. Well, this is the life of census tracts, right? Like, we don't get to pick and choose perfection here because of census tracts. And if we went to block groups, whoa, sorry about that. If we went to block groups, we'd get much more irregular, not good data. So, you know, like, this is kind of the reality of what we have to work with. It's not good or bad, it just is.
Yeah, I mean, it really is just, again, I think you're just gonna, I would redraw these maps. I feel like going out there right now and just like with my support and redraw. Because
you work with the census people on that one.
Yeah, like you're not wrong. For example, like there are certainly some streets, and then you see how they're abutting a very low income community, and this is how Buffalo is a very segregated community, right? Historically and currently, and so what you're seeing is, but it is not uncommon, literally, to jump $60,000 a year in income from one block to the next. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think, and this is the law of averages, right? When you kind of do this, then you kind of go to the least common denominator, and you're going to miss some of that variability block by block. But that is, I think, the reality of how we're dealing with geography.
Yep.
Amanda, I know you wanted to say something, and I also know we have 6 minutes left, so I want to.
This is just so interesting, just showing, you know, we've kind of expanded this definition as we needed to pick up more areas in ground truthing. We're to the point of maybe 40% of areas being included. And so what you're seeing is some of the areas included might not have been in a very tight definition, but as it got bigger, they're kind of in this definition. And this is, maybe a place where individual criteria again become relevant, that perhaps if this neighborhood weren't included, the individual criteria would provide a way for those households that are low to moderate income in that specific area of the tract to be targeted or counted when funding is being considered.
This is extraordinarily helpful conversation to be had, because this is kind of this is like a push-pull type thing, right? So we can lower the amount, not make this as big a tent where we have like 38, 37%, or say a combination of the blue and the red and the yellow, 42% of the tracts being designated. And instead we can kind of constrict that. Well, that means we're going to miss some areas as well. And then if we do that, then having that income area would be good. So those are the decisions that literally, that is something that we have to debate and weigh the pros and cons, and then you all have to make a decision on that. There's no right or wrong answer. It just is a policy decision that you have to make.
Alex, just a quick interruption. So Sonal had a question about what year the census tract data is from.
I don't know if it's the data or the actual outlines. Sonal, is it what year the maps were from, or what year the data is from?
The data.
Okay, so it kind of varies by data point. In most cases, we tried to use the 5-year American Community Survey data, which I don't know if it might have been 2014 through 2019, the most recent available. In some cases, there were metrics that, some of the household income factors, there are certain analysis that HUD does that it went back a little bit later, but generally tried to use the most recent 5-year American Community Survey data.
Okay, thank you.
Headlines themselves just don't change very much from year to year.
Yeah, I guess I was just wondering if the areas that Rob has been pointing out has been more recent and it's turned towards wealth or trying to see if there's an explanation there.
I think there's a couple of things happening. One is some of the gentrification really didn't start until about 2018. After 2018 is when a lot of the gentrification started to happen in many of these neighborhoods that I pointed out. But some of the neighborhoods that I'm pointing out, as I said, they've always just been very, very wealthy and stable in Buffalo, even during the economic decline. So all of Elmwood Village, I would put in that category, especially the parts where they show like Chapin and what have you. But of course, I think it's their proximity to a very low income community, and places like Oxford 10 years ago, primarily African-American, very low income, definitely a DAC, right? But that, and it's also closer to some of like old manufacturing places that have closed. So I could see the pollution being pretty high there. However, in the last 10 years, what we are seeing is huge amounts of displacement, and that those Elmwood Village folks continuing to push those people out, and home prices increasing. So, but like I said, if you walk the neighborhood, depending on which side of Oxford you're on, it's not, you know what I mean? It's uneven and it's obvious. It's challenging. I'm just, it really is challenging.
It is. And I think that this is actually the perfect kind of debate and discussion about, say, that income component, and how big tent do we want to go with the designation of tracks as opposed to income having an overlay on top of it. So we can make this more restrictive. And I know we have 1 minute left, but I'm going to blow your mind if I can get it to work in a minute. Clearly, it's going to take a minute. So this is not a static thing, which means that we can actually take things off of here and make it so that we're making it more restrictive. Fewer percent are designated a DAC if we do this. And now let's see. Whoop. Stop doing that. I think we all talk to our computer sometimes. Man,
I do it all.
It's going to be perfect.
I do it all the time.
Okay.
It's sensing your anxiety.
While you're pulling that up, let me just run through a couple of quick action items, because I know some folks are going to have to leave right after the call. But just a reminder, please, everybody go in and fill out the doodle poll for your availability for the next 3 meetings. And we're going to look to schedule the next meeting the week of the 27th. So remember, by Tuesday, and we'll send out an email to remind you, but by Tuesday, please fill out the doodle poll. And then we'll also work to calendar the next 3 Climate Action Council meetings, so that's all kind of clear what time and what day those meetings will be happening. Okay, Alex, back to you.
Okay, so just the last thing, like if we changed that and made it more restrictive, then you start seeing over here on the diagnostic side, you've got 31% of tracks being designated rather than 37%. If you excluded the blues in scenario 2, then that would actually jive with, Rawa, what you're saying about these different groups or these different regions. And so this is what next time we're going to need to debate and talk through. I think that we have the right inputs into this model. We have the right combinations of weights into these different individual things. what we need to now talk about are some of just the ticky-tacky ways of, do we make tiers of DAX, which I would not recommend for this first year, but something to consider for the next. Do we add an overlay of income? So I would urge you, for each of you, to read through the packet in preparation for the next meeting, come up with questions, and if you have things that you want to add to the ground truthing, please let us know, and we will make it happen or work with you to get that ground truth so that we can see what's going on in each of these areas. And I know I have to jump. I'm sure lots of people do. I do want to thank you for your time. This has been exceptionally helpful.
Thanks, Alex, and thanks everyone. Any last minute questions or points that folks want to make before we say goodbye? Okay, so we'll follow up with a summary email with action items. And thanks again for the time this afternoon. Have a great weekend, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Bye.